This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. The right materials, the proper approach, and sufficient technical skills. This is the recipe for successful conservation. Remove any one of these elements, and success is further out of reach. Remove multiple, and now we're into fail territory. But even with the right materials, the correct approach, and technical skills, success is not guaranteed, as was the case with this antebellum portrait. Even though the correct materials were at hand, at least some of them, and theoretically this was a sound approach, and with some technical ability to execute this, somehow this treatment was an abject failure. The tears are visible even after mounting, and the retouching is pretty terrible. And on top of all of that, the painting was mounted to a piece of foam board, not an appropriate material. So now I get the privilege of cleaning up this mess. This was likely a case of some creative person thinking they knew what they were doing and all of a sudden finding themselves in over their heads with nowhere to go but further down the rabbit hole. And I get it. If you're creative, you think you can solve any problem. But sometimes it doesn't go according to plan. At least if you don't have Squarespace, it doesn't. And that's because Squarespace has done the heavy lifting for you. With their fluid design engine and their AI-powered design intelligence software, you don't need to know any code to build a beautiful and mobile-friendly website that works everywhere. Simply using drag-and-drop technology, you can design and build your website. And Squarespace's AI can help you make it better with no experience necessary. But if you do run into a problem, Squarespace has thought of that too, with online tutorials, articles, videos, webinars, and a robust forum filled with thousands of people just like you working through and solving problems just like yours. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Before any work can really commence on this painting, it needs to be faced with a piece of Japanese mulberry paper to stabilize it and protect it. And so I'm heating up some fish gelatin adhesive. This is an adhesive that is strong enough to hold the paper to the face of the painting, but not so strong that I can't remove it later on. So once this adhesive has been heated up, I'll then take my piece of paper and effectively glue it to the front of the painting. This will hold any paint that might want to detach. We know there are tears, so this will help stabilize them, and it will protect the painting from handling as I work through the conservation process. I'll start by applying the adhesive in the center and then working out to the edges so that I can remove all of these little air bubbles. And then I let it dry and say goodbye to our friend. While some of the materials used in this attempted conservation were appropriate, many were not, like the board to which this painting was glued. This is a piece of foam board. It's got two pieces of rigid material on the outer sides, and then it's filled with foam. This is non-archival, this is not acid-free, this is not a conservation material. This is also nothing that a painting should be bonded to, so it needs to come off. And it begins by removing that outer surface to get access to that foam layer. Once I've pried off all of this board, then I can start removing some of this foam. And I start with my scalpel, just slicing it away. But unfortunately, this foam, well, even with a new blade, it's really hard to remove. And so it has me thinking that there must be a better way. And I remember back to my crafting days when I was a kid and how solvents reacted with foam. So I've chosen a solvent, and now I'm going to simply dissolve this foam. When exposed to this solvent, the foam melts. And after a few minutes of working it, it's proving to be much easier than using a scalpel to slice it off. A few more minutes, and we have almost all of the foam completely dissolved into a slushy, sludgy liquid. And then that can be easily removed. So, I'm going to try working smarter, not harder on this piece, as I remove all of this foam, which will give me access to the other piece of board that the painting is glued to. While this is in fact working smarter, it's also working messier, but sometimes that's just how things go. And if I have to get a little dirty in order to save myself some time, well, that's an equation I'm willing to take. Compared to slicing and scraping off all of this foam board, the solvent approach is clearly the winner. Even if it is messier, I'll take it. With all of the foam now gone, I can start to remove the board. And I'm going to start by using my scalpel to scrape it away. This is not paper, this is something else. If it were paper, it would come off very easily. This is very rigid and very compressed, so it's very difficult to slice it off. I'm going to try using a different solvent to see if that can soften up the adhesive and make the removal a little bit easier. Again, trying to work smarter. It does appear to have the desired effect, but it's still very slow going and very, very tedious. Even working as fast as I can, this little section took, maybe 25 or 30 minutes, and that's not going to be sufficient for the entire painting. But while working with this material, I noticed a familiar smell that led me to believe that this was an adhesive that I had come across before. And so, again, trying to work smarter, I'm going to try another approach to remove all of this board. And it begins on my hot table, where I had heated up the table to a whopping 150 degrees. I'm adding some more of that solvent that I found successful in softening up the adhesive. And then I'm going to start prying it back. And lo and behold, it starts to work much better. So I'll flip over the painting, leaving the board on the table, and now I can effectively just peel this painting off. This is a conservation grade adhesive, but unfortunately it was used on a non-conservation grade board. And the reason that I couldn't just take the board and place it on the hot table is because of all of that foam. You see, foam is an incredible insulator. And so no matter how hot I got this table, that heat wouldn't transfer to this top layer where the painting was bonded to the board and soften up the adhesive. And that's why I had to remove all of that foam. But with direct access to the adhesive, the heat does its job and softens it up, and I can start to peel back this painting a lot easier and faster than if I were simply scraping it off with a scalpel. Now, that said, it still does take a good half an hour of working on a very, very hot table. Not something that I am terribly keen on during the fall. In the winter, maybe, but right now, this was a very hot and sweaty mess. Eventually, though, I did get the painting removed from the board, but there was still a lot of adhesive residue on the back. So using the solvent while the painting was still hot, I'm going to remove all of that residue. I'll try not to burn my hands while I'm doing this. A piece of felt helps a little bit. Once all of the adhesive is off, I can take the painting over to the front of the studio and I can start to remove these patches or inlays. Prying them up with my scalpel reveals that this is actually just tape. It's not canvas, and this was inlaid where clearly they had cut away the canvas. No natural tears have such clean, crisp lines or corners. Now at this point, I'm ready to do the structural work, but I have to take off the facing because the painting is stabilized and held into position right now, but it's not completely flat. So, adding a little bit of warm water to the fish gelatin, I can soften it up and peel back this facing paper. It's a little slow going, but that's fine. I've saved tons of time in the other steps, so if I have to spend a little bit here, I'm okay with that. Once the facing is removed, we can see that we haven't lost any paint, and the facing has done its job well. And now I'm ready to transfer the painting back to the hot table where I've let it cool just a little bit. I don't need it to be a full 150 degrees. And I've placed a nylon release layer in between the canvas and the absorbent blotter film. And this is going to make sure that whatever adhesive residues are still on the canvas aren't used to inadvertently glue the painting to the absorbent blotter layer, which is going to pull out any adhesive and moisture that's in this canvas, allowing me to flatten it and get rid of the ripples and all of these creases where the tears were. I'll use my bone folder to encourage the painting to lie flat. You see, when they mounted it, the seams weren't perfectly aligned, and so they were standing up. But now I can get them flat, which is critically necessary to making them disappear. Once the painting's been brought up to temperature, I'll turn the heat off, I'll allow it to cool, and then I'll remove the painting from this Mylar envelope and transfer it over to the back table. It's going to rest under weights here for a few days to acclimatize to the studio's relative humidity. I don't want the canvas distorting after doing a procedure to remove distortions. So, under the weights you go. A few days later, actually a whole new week later, I'll come and remove the painting from the weights. And we can see there aren't major distortions. There are some little waves, but those are fine, and I can get rid of those in the lining process. For the most part, though, the painting is ready for the next step, which is dealing with the voids. Remember, somebody just simply cut out the canvas here? My guess is that there were some holes or tears, and for some reason, they thought it would be a wiser decision to simply cut out the existing canvas. So I need to replace it with some new canvas. And I've turned to my stock of old canvases and found one that has a similar weight and weave. This is a very fine canvas, probably a portrait linen. And so I can use some of my portrait linen to replace that void. I'll create a little inlay, I'll cut it out, and then test fit it. And it looks pretty good. So I'll do that with all of the other pieces. And then I'll remove them and flip over the canvas so that I have access to the back where I will bond those new inlays to the canvas. After orienting them and making sure they're where we want them, I'll come back with a piece of washi kozo. That's the same Japanese mulberry paper that I glued to the face of the painting. I'll trace out a shape that mirrors the inlay, and then I'll tear it out of the paper. And I want to tear it so that there are frayed edges, which are a softer transition, and ensure that there isn't a telegraphing of this paper patch to the front of the painting. That would be a really big problem, and I would likely have to undo all of this work to correct it. Using a little bit of conservation grade adhesive, I'll bond this piece of paper down to the canvases, and this will hold the inlay in place so it doesn't shift during handling, and it will make sure that it's held in place so that if there are humidity changes, it doesn't move around. Now I'm going to be using the same adhesive that they used in their failed attempt, but I'm going to be doing it, well, the right way. So after cleaning off the back of the canvas, making sure there are no little bits of detritus stuck in there, I'll lay down a piece of flat spun nylon gossamer. And this is going to be helpful in case this painting ever does need to be removed from my support in the future. This can be used to peel off the entire painting from the interleaf and the lining that I'm going to add without stressing the canvas. Had this been there in place when I had to remove it, it would have been so much easier. So you're welcome in 200 years when this needs to be removed. I was thinking of you. I'll trim off all of the excess because it doesn't need to be there and it just gets in the way. And then I can start assembling the painting for the interleafed lining. Those tears were massively impressive, and anytime a canvas has that much structural damage, there really is no choice but to add a new piece of structural support to the back. In this case, a piece of Belgian linen. But between the new canvas and the old canvas, I'm adding a piece of PET film, which has been coated with the same adhesives. And this is going to be effectively like a metal plate in a broken bone. It's an extra layer of stability and security. This will also immobilize this canvas so that during humidity changes, there's much less movement. And that's going to help prevent those tears and seams from standing up and becoming visible later on. We don't want to do all of this work just to have in a couple of years the seams and the tears become visible. So back to the hot table, wrapped with some cotton webbing, which will allow me to extract all of the air, underneath the Mylar, taped down to the table to ensure we have an airtight envelope. The through bag connectors go in, which will allow me to pull that air out with the vacuum pump. I'll raise the painting up to temperature, turn on the vacuum pump, and apply pressure downward. Once the painting has been lined, it is now time to clean it. And this is both exciting and terrifying, because given the state of the work that we saw before, I don't know what we're going to find. Almost instantly, we can see that there's a lot of old varnish on this painting and a lot of overpainting. Just this corner alone has darkened this swab. I suspect, if the retouching on the face was any indication, that this whole painting has been butchered with retouching. And you can see just how thick the varnish is and the old retouching because it totally hides the texture of the canvas. So now it's time to see just how bad this really is. With all of the overpainting removed, I now have the sneaking suspicion that the painting wasn't actually ever cleaned, so I'm using a neutral organic soap that I mix in the studio to remove all of the surface grime, and lo and behold, this painting was never cleaned before they did all of this work. Maybe I should take back what I said about technical skills and the right approach. With all of the old varnish, all of the old overpainting, and all of the old grime removed, I can now deal with some of the areas that are standing proud. This is some of the old overpainting that I just couldn't get off, and some of the old fill-in. I'll need to get these off because they stand proud and they'll catch the light. So using a very new, very sharp scalpel blade, I'll just remove them. It's not that difficult, and it's revealing just how sloppy this work actually was. With those voids, I now have to fill them with some putty so that we don't see any of the seams. I've always found it easier to lay it on thick and kind of liberally, and then go ahead and remove it, as opposed to trying to be super neat on the application side, which never works and it just takes up so much more time. There are a lot of areas of loss here, the big patches and all of those tears that need to be filled in. And once the fill-in medium has been allowed to dry for a few hours in this case, I'll come back with a piece of felt and I'll dampen that and use that as effectively like a sandpaper. I saw a master plasterer do this on a skim-coated wall to achieve a perfectly smooth surface, and so I thought, why not borrow that technique and apply it to my work? And it works, so I'll continue to do it. I want to remove as much of the fill-in as possible, leaving it only where it's absolutely necessary, where there's no paint, so that I have a surface onto which to retouch. So back and forth between the swab and the felt, and eventually I'll get it all removed. At one point, this painting probably had a stretcher or strainer support, but that was unceremoniously discarded when they decided to mount this to a piece of foam board. So I need to make something so that we can display this canvas. And I've chosen to make a strainer as opposed to a stretcher because this painting is interleafed and it doesn't need the tension that a stretcher can afford. A simple strainer will suffice. So after cutting it down to size, I'll then run it through my table saw to create a bevel so that there's airflow and that the edge doesn't touch the canvas. I have to do this for all four sides. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated here. It's just basic table saw usage, but it's incredibly helpful to have the proper tools. Once all the pieces are cut, I will then glue them together. And with the help of a band clamp, I can ensure that there is even and adequate tension on all of these joints. Once the glue is dried, I'll remove the band clamp, remove all of the corners, and then I will start to brace this strainer in the corners. I'm going to be using some African mahogany here because that's what I have on hand. I've cut it down to size 1 inch, and now I'm using my router to create a dado. Into this dado, I will place these pieces, and that will give some extra support to these joints. I'll glue them into place, these don't need to come out, and then press them in. And that's pretty much it. Once the glue is dry here, I'll trim off the excess with a Japanese saw, which is a flush cut, and then I'll sand down everything so that it is nice and smooth and looks good. This should hopefully answer everybody who keeps telling me to use dowels or biscuits or dominoes or butterflies or something else to support the corners. These little inlays should do just that. Now I can stretch this painting to the strainer. It's not very complicated. I start in the center and work my way to the edges. I don't need to use my pulling pliers because the painting isn't going to stretch because of that rigid PET interleaf. It's a fairly small painting, so stretching it onto this support doesn't take too much time. And once it's all done, I can then trim off all of the excess material, this canvas that is cut oversized. After cutting the corners, I'll then slice down the overhang to create a nice even and flush surface. I'll trim it off with the scissors where the knife doesn't reach, and then I'll fold it under itself and tack it with a lighter weight steel upholstery tack. I'll tuck the corners in to make sure they don't fray and come undone, and then add a couple more tacks, and the stretching is all complete. And now I can take it back to the back of the studio for the application of the isolation layer, which will come before I start the retouching. Anytime a painting has a lot of retouching or has a lot of dark colors, I like to apply this isolation layer because it's an assist for color matching. You see, when I apply this layer, the painting gets saturated. The colors look rich and dark, how they will look if I apply a varnish. So then I can retouch according to this look. When I apply the final varnish, the sheen is all that's going to change. The colors won't. And so now it's on to retouching. Unlike previously, I'm using a very small brush and just applying paint where paint is missing. I'm not looking to glaze in or repaint any part of this painting. I just want to add paint where there is no paint so that the image comes together. And this may be more tedious. In fact, it is more tedious than taking a big brush and just covering all of the losses, but this is the right way to do it. So even if you have the right materials, you still need to know how to use them. And previously, where this whole triangle of white was overpainted, we couldn't see the buttons, but now we can. And so I'm going to work really hard to make sure that they're not lost. This white actually takes a little bit more time than I expected. It's not pure white, and it's not cool white or warm white. It's a little bit of everything, so I have to mix a whole bunch of colors to get it to disappear. But eventually I do, and now, well, his shirt just looks like a shirt. After all of that retouching, it's now time to add the final varnish, and this is a synthetic ultraviolet stable layer of resin that will mostly, in this case, protect the painting and just adjust the sheen. I mentioned that the painting isn't going to change in terms of colors all that much, and that's good because my retouching matches now. I don't want it to look any different. Once I've applied the varnish, I'll then start brushing it out so to knock down a little bit of that gloss. I don't want it to look plasticky or too slippery or shiny. By going over the painting with my brush and then my badger hair brush, I can create a very fine micro texture, and that helps refract the light when it hits the surface. And I think it just looks absolutely gorgeous. When our friend arrived, he was clearly a mess. The right materials and correct approach couldn't save this painting from ineptitude. But by working methodically and systematically undoing all of the old work and removing all of the old materials and deliberately working to make a better result, the painting and the sitter look wonderful. And I'd say we've cleaned up this mess.